Here we go. So again, from ASQ announcements, they're just advising us every couple months. They let us know on the status of whether they regard it safe to have face-to-face meetings, such as our leadership team meetings and the program meeting, any courses or web or face-to-face educational events. And right now they're still saying, well, let's hold off through the end of June. So it looks like our first hybrid program meeting with both face-to-face component and virtual will be our July program meeting. On the World Quality Congress, it was going to be hybrid, again, combination of in-person and virtual, but again, because of the continuing coronavirus contagion, that they've decided that it will only be virtual. And as a consequence, there will not be any watch party, something that we've been communicating for several months now. And that was all still active while it was a hybrid meeting, but now that they've gone to virtual, they're just not offering that. Everybody will have to get their own individual registration to participate in any of the WCQI presentations. But then in 2022, they are planning to pick up the face-to-face conference again, and it will be next door in California, in Anaheim. So that would be rather convenient for us. Let's see. Final news, big news from ASQ. They're planning to launch a mobile app where you can access a lot of ASQ content that you would normally go to your laptop or desktop computer. It will now be available to you via mobile app. It's in beta testing right now, and they plan to have it ready, if not before, certainly by the World Conference on Quality and Improvement, the launch date. So big news from ASQ on that. From the Phoenix side, the Phoenix section side, we do keep track of your satisfaction of our program presentations. And you see, let's see, in 2020, our average was 82% satisfaction. And so far this year, we're 85 and 86 plus, so we're doing well. And our attendance has also been increasing, as you can see by the column to the right. Thank not only our section members, but those of you who are not members of our section that have heard of our program meetings and speakers, maybe through My ASQ, and you have availed yourself to the free program meeting, and we want to welcome everybody, and we're glad to have you. Again, we just briefly, we worked on our strategic plan for this year, 2021, and we made sure that our plans aligned with ASQ strategies. And so we have, I think it's 10 strategic plans, which are improvement-oriented plans. Those are over and above the 14, what we call operational plans, things that we just have to do to keep the train on the track, so to speak. So for example, we have to have our monthly leadership team meetings. We have our monthly program meetings. We have the monthly newsletter. We make sure we have current updates to our My ASQ page. All those are what we would call operational things. So these are what we plan to do on a strategic level. And notice one of them was we were going to explore the interest and feasibility of building a section mobile app, even before we had heard that ASQ headquarters was developing an app. And since then, they've kind of said, well, hold off on going any further than exploring the interest for a section app. Let's first all get this higher level ASQ app up and running. So that one, we may take it only so far this year, and then whatever becomes of the interest, we will then consider pursuit in a following year. So you see our progress report. We do have a dashboard where we red, yellow, green. So as we're making progress, we'll have various shades. Notice a couple odd shades in here. So we already had one of two, at least two joint events with a division in January. So now we're working on coordinating the second event, and not to say there won't be more than two, but that's our strategy, is to deliver at least two. And then as far as joint sessions with other sections, well, we're already working with the Pikes Peak section within the mountain region of ASQ to coordinate one of their program meetings. So we are starting to make progress. Two other key strategies that we have this year, as were mentioned by John Linland and Gabe Bays, is our membership chair. He's working on the other. So we have an unpaid member survey. These are people who their renewal has officially expired. So they go into the unpaid, but then ASQ keeps you on the books, so to speak, for 6 months beyond your expiration. This is our opportunity to reach out to these people to identify, A, do they plan to come back? Maybe they haven't yet renewed because it's really into the hands of their employer, and their employer just hasn't submitted the payment yet. We want to know if they plan to renew, and if not, why not? Is there anything we as a section can do to help improve their experience? And then these pulse surveys is just to get a quarterly pulse of our membership as far as overall satisfaction, willingness to recommend, opportunities for improvement. So those are other two key strategies. And if anybody has an interest in joining the leadership team, we do have a call for volunteers as our newsletter editor. Walter Teague did a wonderful job for us over the course of 17 years as our newsletter editor, but he decided it was time for him to retire. And so in the interim, I am taking over, but I would be more than happy to train somebody how to fulfill the role of our newsletter editor to publish the Sundial every month. Much of the content is already coming to you as the newsletter editor. So you don't have to do a lot of soliciting information. We have it already set up where certain contributors provide their information, and the newsletter editor doesn't do a lot of design or layout. It's mainly just editing, creating a PDF, and then sending out in a couple of bulk emails. So that's really, it's not that large of a job as compared to what it used to be. So that's it for my presentation. I would like now to introduce the guest speaker for this evening. Linda Westfall is the president of the Westfall team, and her topic for tonight is Scrum 101, a basic overview of the Agile Scrum process. So Linda is the president of the Westfall team, which provides software engineering, quality, and project management training and consulting services. She has more than 40 years of experience in the software industry. Linda is also the author of the Software Quality Engineer Handbook, ASQ certification. She is the past chair of the software division, a contributor to the Project Management Institute's PMBOK, or Project Management Body of Knowledge. She's an ASQ fellow and has certifications through ASQ as well as PMI and other organizations. And interestingly, Linda's hobbies include building fireworks. She's a Pyrotechnics Guild International Grand Master. So that should be interesting to hear some discussions. How do you tie that into Scrum process? Anyhow, so the abstract for tonight, the webinar is a basic introduction to the Scrum process. It will describe the duties of the three major Scrum roles of product owner, Scrum development team, and the Scrum Master. We'll also discuss the basic steps in the Scrum process, including the Scrum planning meeting, and there are iterations called sprints, and of the Scrum meetings, or these daily stand-up meetings. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Linda. I've got to get up and let's see, participants, make Linda a presenter, co-host, I guess they call them here. And now, Linda, you should be able to bring up your presentation.
Okay, it says this will stop others from sharing their screen. Okay,
Yeah,
Let me go to from the current slide. And see if I can share my screen,
that's what's
hopefully,
happening. There we go.
from the beginning.
Yay.
Yay, I think we got it. Now I want to swap this so you can see the big picture. There we go. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to talk about Scrum today. And Scrum is one of the most popular of the Agile frameworks. So we're going to dig a little deep in this. One of the questions I got in the breakout session was, what is Scrum? And basically, I told him to just be patient, that was what we were going to answer in this presentation today.
So just to note, what we're seeing is your current slide and the next slide.
Okay. How do I get you on? You are screen
Whatever you
sharing. Let
did.
me see.
You can go to display settings and then at the top left corner and then click swap view. Yes, and it should swap it.
There we go.
Okay.
Thank you, Chris.
So it's interesting that, yeah, I thought I was sharing that screen and it's, okay, I'm back to this way. So you can see just the slide now, right?
Correct.
Okay, so let's talk about Agile in general for a second. Agile is over 20 years old now, by the way. They just had their 20th anniversary of a group of consultants, each of which had their own frameworks, but they all shared a set of similar beliefs, got together in Sunbird, Utah, and had this meeting. And out of that came the very first meeting they had, the Agile Manifesto. So this group of people said, hey, what we share is a common set of beliefs, that they are uncovering better ways of developing software. At that point, Agile was very software, but it's expanded from that, by doing it and by helping others do it. Through that, we've come to have these core values. The first one is that individuals and interactions are more important than processes and tools. That working software is more important than comprehensive documentation, that customer collaboration is more important than contract negotiation, and responding to change is more important than following the plan. Now, many people drop this last sentence, but I think it's all important. That is, while there is value to the items on the right, we just value the things on the left more, folks. And in fact, one of the ways I like to think of it is the things on the right support and provide the ability to do the things on the left. For example, good tools like Zoom allow us to get together and interact. It allows us, good processes tell people what to do, how to do it, when to do it, who to do it with, which helps the individual be able to do their job better. Good checklists, good training helps the individual do their job better. So the things on the right will never save your project, but they can definitely support your project. For example, if you have lousy processes and antiquated tools, good people can still get their work done. It may be harder for them, it may take them longer, they may struggle more, but they'll save your project. Great tools without good people will never save your project. You can have the best processes in the world, but if you have people that aren't trained, that don't know what they're doing, that aren't talking to each other, you're gonna have a disaster. Good documentation. The Agilists believe in documentation light. The minimum you can get away with. That doesn't mean they throw the baby out with the bathwater and you stop doing requirements, you stop doing design, you stop writing project plans. No, no, no. But the goal is to get the product done. Now, notice it says working software. As Agile or Scrum specifically expands out beyond software, it just replace that with getting a working product, whatever that working product is. Because, you know, you can write documentation all day long, but it doesn't get the product out the door. It doesn't earn you money. It doesn't make your customers happy. They need the working product. We need to be collaborating with and talking to our customers. Again, a good contract, just like a good fence, makes better neighbors or better customers. But we've got to be talking to our customers. How can we build a product? You know, that whole concept of the voice of the customer. We got to be talking to them. And if you have a project of any size, something that's going to last 6 months or a year or several years, folks, if you're not talking to your customer, if you're not responding to change, the product becomes antiquated before you even get it built. And this was one of the things that it always struck me in software, because when I took the PMI stuff, you know, one of their tenets is you've got to be continuously responding to change. You've got to be progressively elaborating your project plans as you learn more. But somehow in software, we did these big plans up front and then pretended they were like in concrete. And we'd end up delivering the project or delivering an antiquated project or 50% late or 100% over budget or whatever, because we weren't adopting and adapting appropriately. So a lot of the Agile, I think, came out of the fact that waterfall just didn't work in many cases. And especially where you had very complex projects, very technically complex, or we didn't even know the technology, we were discovering it as we go, especially on projects where we're building software and the hardware that's going to run on at the same time, or that you are having to discover the requirements as you go. We all have encountered the customer who says, I'll know it when I see it, or I really don't know what I want, but I'll know it when I see it. So those are some of the basic Agile manifesto. Then we have the principles behind that. Basic Agile principles, the highest priority is to satisfy the customer. One of the things I love about Agile is it's like they've rediscovered all the things that we in quality have been trying to preach to them for years, but somehow now that it's their idea, you know, in fact, they don't even mention Deming and Duran and Sheward and all of those people, although I am starting to see some of those quotes creep back into Agile. But the basic premise is that customer focus, continuous improvement philosophy that those of us in quality have been preaching to them for years. Through that early and continuous delivery of value added. And again, if you're not in software, just replace it with value added product to the customers or value added services to the customers. We got to welcome change, even late in the development cycle. We may have that 6-month-long project and 2 weeks before delivery, something has changed. The environment has changed. The customers have changed their mind. The situation has changed. The competition has brought a challenge to the corporation or to the customers. So Agile's got to harness that to the customer's competitive advantage so that we're always keeping up with the most recent needs and providing that valuable product to the field. We've got to deliver those working products and services frequently, from a couple of days to a couple of months. The Agilists are always talking about the minimal viable product that provides value. You can always refine it later, add more features, add more functions, you know, but get the base product to the customer, let them see it, let them start using it. And that's one of the reasons they use this iterative development process. The business people, your stakeholders, your customers, your users have to be working daily or very closely with the development project so that you're communicating that you're actually living and breathing the voice of the customer. You know what's valuable to your customers and you're prioritizing your work to provide the next most valuable thing next. You're going to build projects around motivated individuals, good engineers doing their job. Folks, they know their job better than anybody else. This goes back, harkens back to the total quality management. You've got to get everybody involved, but it takes it one step further and says, yes, but the people directing the work are the people doing the work. They know more about it than anybody else. And you need to give them a general direction, provide them with the environment, the support they need, and then trust them to go do the job. You need to empower your teams to go produce the product under management's general direction and vision, but they know best how to do their individual job. And the most efficient and effective methods for conveying information within the team and between the team and everyone else is face-to-face conversations. And if you can't get face-to-face, then virtual face-to-face. We're doing more and more of that all the time, but we're still meeting, we're still seeing each other. We've got that two-way communications going. Every time you write something down, you're going back to one-way communications, and it's just not the most effective or efficient way. Having a working finished product delivered to the customer is the primary measure of success. If you're not moving forward by creating a product, I don't care how much documentation, how many designs, how many requirements documents you have nothing to deliver, you haven't really made any progress. Agile processes promote sustainable development. The sponsors, the developers, the users should be able to maintain that pace indefinitely. This harkens back to the studies that have been done on people's productivity levels. There's a reason that we settled on the 40-hour work week, because it's just, studies show that it's the optimum as far as productivity and quality. As you start going to longer and longer work weeks, not only does productivity stay constant, people working 40 hours get just as much done as people working 70 hours. And oh, by the way, quality starts dropping off because people get tired, they get burned out, etc. So we need that sustainable development pace. And we've got to pay continuous attention to the excellence of your technology, the good designs, that enhances agility. Folks, defects are a major, major cost of waste. And this is especially true in software, but it's true everywhere. Better to do it right the first time. That's the fastest, the easiest, the most agile way of doing something. The Agile principles believe in simplicity, doing them, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done. Don't add features and functions to your products and services that somebody might need sometime in the future, but they don't need it now. You're just adding complexity, which may introduce additional defects. Build them that minimal viable product and then let them see it and tell you what else they want, what else is valuable to them. So start as simple as you can. The best architectures, the best designs, the best requirements come out of these self-organized teams. Get your subject matter experts together who know what they're doing, get them talking to each other, get them exchanging ideas. That's why I love these breakout sessions. You can learn so much from just 15 minutes of talking to somebody else that's also an expert in the quality arena. The same thing is true with your teams that are building products. And at regular intervals, you got to stop and reflect on how to become more effective, and then tune and adjust your behaviors accordingly. So these are the basic Agile principles that go behind the manifesto. And the reason I wanted to start by introducing these is this is all built into the framework that comes into Scrum. And we'll point out some of the reasons or some of the ways that Scrum does those things as we go on through this talk. Now, Robert, I assume everybody's able to turn themselves out of mute, folks. If you have questions, just go ahead and interrupt me, because I'd rather answer your questions while we're on that slide. You don't have to hold them till the end.
Right. Everybody should be able to unmute themselves.
Okay, great. I just want to say that I know I talk a little fast sometimes because I got a lot to cover, but please go ahead and interrupt me. Okay, I mentioned that Agile is an umbrella of frameworks and methodologies. Scrum being probably the most widely adopted, the most used of all of them, definitely the most documented of all of them, but it's the one I see most often. Some of the others are listed here. Notice that Lean, which came out of the quality community, has been adapted as an Agile philosophy. The Kanban that you're probably familiar with, even if you've never done any Agile work, has come out of that, and so on. I'm not going to read the list. The list keeps expanding. Every once in a while, some new technique comes out. I mean, when I say once in every while, maybe weekly or monthly sometimes it seems. But Scrum is still the most popular of them. So let's talk Scrum. There are 3 primary roles within Scrum. These 3 roles make up what's called the Scrum Team. Within the Scrum Team, we have the product owner that represents all the stakeholders, the Scrum Master, who is the person that is basically the coach or the person that's going to own the Scrum process, teach it to everybody, etc., and the people actually doing the work, the development team. And I'll talk about each of these. I've got a slide on each of these. There are potentially other Scrum roles. For example, management's going to set the direction. They're going to set the vision and scope for the project, but then leave it to the developers, give them the development team, give them the tools, the training, the support they need, and then let them run with it. You've got the customers, the users, and other stakeholders who are providing input into what's valuable, and the product owner represents all of those. So if a customer wants something new, another stakeholder has something that's valuable to them, they go to the product owner, and the product owner will decide the priority of that work within the product backlog. So let's talk about these 3 roles. The product owner is basically responsible for the project. They are there to make sure that the most valuable things are being done, that funding is happening. You've got the initial funding and the ongoing funding. All of the stakeholder needs all get funneled through the product owner, and they are the contact with the development team, the rest of the Scrum team. They're going to manage and control that product backlog and make it visible not only to the Scrum team, but to management, customers, and other stakeholders. So people can see in that product backlog what priority their particular features, functions, whatever have, when they're going to be coming up, etc. And they're going to be working with the team to prioritize all of those product backlog items and estimate the amount of effort and size of each of those. The development team's actually going to be doing the work. This is a self-managed team. Again, you don't have a lead anymore. You don't have a manager. People are managing themselves. They are self-selecting what work they want to do. I mean, how much motivation is that to be able to pick what you want to work on next? You don't get assigned to tasks you have no interest in or no ability or skill for. But this does need to be a cross-functional team. They need to have all the skills necessary to develop the product. So again, I'm most familiar with software. If you need people that know how to code, if you need people that know how to design, if you need people that know how to test, if you need people that know how to write user documents, whatever you need, you got somebody on the team that can do it. Now, that doesn't mean that the same person can't do 2 or 3 of those, but you have to have somebody on the team that has that skill and knowledge. If all you have is people who want to code, then everybody's going to want to pick the coding tasks and nobody's going to want to pick the writing of the user document tasks. You need that cross-functional team. And they're going to decide what they want to do. Notice we call it a methodology or a framework. The details are left up to the development team. How you go about doing this is up to you. What you're going to do comes from the product owner. The main vision for the product comes from senior management and above, but how you do your day-to-day work is a decision from the team. And they're going to turn those sprint backlog items, the ones you select for each iteration, into an increment of working product. Again, I'm substituting software for product because I know a lot of you may not be in the software industry. They're going to be responsible for the success of each iteration and for the overall project as a whole. Now, again, the product owner owns the project's success, but the individual development team is the one that builds the product and makes it successful based on the requirements established by the product owner. Then you have the Scrum Master. And this is not a project manager or the manager of the team. This is more a coach rather than a manager. But they're responsible for the Scrum process. They've had detailed training in it. In fact, I've got multiple certifications in being an Agile Scrum Master at various levels. But they're going to coach the team on the process, teach the team the process, fit that into the overall workings of the organization. They're also there to protect the team from outside distractions and interference. Somebody comes to the team and says, I need to borrow Henry for the next 2 days because I've got this critical. No. The members of the team work on one and only one thing. They are dedicated. If you're doing pure Scrum, they're 100% dedicated. Or they're at least partially dedicated, because if, for example, Henry has to support some older product, then you only get a percentage of his time on the Scrum team, but the Scrum Master would protect that percentage. For example, if he's only supposed to work half time on the team, the Scrum Master makes sure that at least 4 hours a day, he's working on team-directed stuff. Getting any resources, removing impediments, anything that's standing in the team's way, the Scrum Master is going to work with the product owner, the team, and anyone outside the team they need to work with to help remove those barriers, those impediments. If there's any risks, they are going to, again, help make sure that those risks are mitigated appropriately. They're going to help adopt, adapt, and continuously improve those Scrum processes to meet the needs of the team and the organization as a whole. But again, the team decides how to do the work under the coaching of the Scrum Master. But it's the team that actually runs the plays. Think of it as a football team. There's a coach, but the coach may help call some of the plays and things, but it's the quarterback and the rest of the team out on the field that do all the implementation and decide how a specific play is going to be run. They also act as a facilitator for all the meetings, and we'll talk about each of these different meetings as part of this presentation. They are there to facilitate the gathering of team consensus, make sure that there is agreement on how they want to work, on what they should be working on next, etc. And they're going to be the capturer of any metrics, any data. They're going to help determine the team's velocity. This is like productivity, but productivity is typically measured in work product produced per hour. Velocity is work produced per calendar time, because you've got a fixed team of people working 100% or some proportion of 100% on that product. Your team size is fixed. So we just do it by calendar day, and that's velocity rather than productivity. And there's the Scrum framework or the Scrum process in a nutshell. And I'm going to break this down and walk you through the process. But that's the basic sum total of the architecture of the activities in this process. So we're going to start by senior management creating some kind of vision for a new product, or if it's an older product, they've decided to transition to an agile environment. That vision is going to be of what the future product is going to look like. They're going to look at return on investment. They may do some release planning, etc., but they're going to start the project or make a decision to start the project. And from that initial vision, you're going to break it down and start creating that initial backlog of activities. And we'll talk about that, but this is literally a list of reminders of things to do. And we put those in priority order. The product owner is responsible for keeping those in priority order. And we call these stories, folks, or epics. An epic is simply a very large story that is too big of an amount of work to do in a single iteration. Notice as we move to the top of the list, the highest priority things, all you have is stories, because it's got to be broken down small enough to be a story before it can be pulled into the next iteration. And we'll talk about how that's done in a minute. But this is simply a list of stories and epics. And all change happens on this product backlog. If there's a change in a business need, maybe a story is removed, another story is added, an epic is moved or added. We're going to refine those epics into smaller and smaller stories as we learn things. An epic is too big and too broad, but we put it there as a reminder to have those further conversations, to break it on down into something that's manageable in an iteration. And what's on the backlog is also going to be dictated by how quickly or how slowly the team actually translates the backlog into a working product. So each iteration, you're going to slice off one iteration's worth of stories and go work on them. And of course, that removes those from the backlog and the rest of the backlog moves up. While that iteration is happening, then new stories, new epics can be added to this product backlog, but it doesn't interrupt the work of the team. So what's a story? Basic template for story, simple as this kind of stakeholder, whoever I am. I can have some kind of feature or function in order to, what's the benefit or reason for doing that? They call them stories because, again, voice of the customer, you want your customer telling you stories about how they need to or have in the past used that system. So we just call them stories. Now, a very large story like an epic, I use the pay at the gas pump system a lot because everybody's used it, everybody knows about it. So as a customer of the gas station, I can purchase gas at the pump in order to make it faster and more convenient to buy gas. Okay, so that's a very large story. In fact, that's almost a vision statement for what the whole system's going to be. Obviously, it's too big to build in a single 2-week period. So you're going to start breaking it down into smaller and smaller stories until it's something that's small enough to work with. But we're going to leave it on the backlog as an epic until we're ready to start, almost ready to start working on it. Why? Because things are going to change. And if I take that and break it down into all of its individual little tiny stories, then I'm going to have more rework. I'm going to have to come back and revisit it and revisit it and revisit it. So I can just leave this as a major feature and then break it down in a meeting just before I'm ready to use it. So again, smaller stories as a customer, I can scan my debit or credit card. I can enter my security PIN or zip code. I can, as a gas station owner, I can get the credit or debit card and its PIN approved before I let them pump gas. So I get ensure that I get paid, et cetera, whatever those stories might be. And we start breaking those down from the epic. So that's where the backlog refinement meeting comes in. While the iteration is happening over here to the right, and I'll talk about it later, the product owner gets together with stakeholders and representatives from the team and periodically has a backlog refinement meeting. The intent of this meeting is to get the stories ready to be selected into a future sprint. So you have these typically at least once sometime during the sprint, sometimes 2 times, depending on what you need to be doing. But what you're doing is getting stories ready for the next sprint so that they can be selected into future sprints. And you're basically breaking them down on the backlog. Now, this comes out of Agile in general for user stories, but it applies very much to the Scrum methodology. User stories have what are called the 3 C's. The 3 C's are the card, the conversation, and the confirmation. What I just showed you is the card. If I come back here, I will have a card that says, as a customer, I can enter my debit card PIN at the pump in order to ensure the security of my card. That's a card. And the reason they were called cards is they used to be 3x5 cards up on a board someplace, and they would just move across that board. Now in this, 20 years later, we have tools that do all that for us. So it's not really a card anymore, but the card is that reminder to go have the conversation later on and drill it on down just before we're ready to start implementing it. So we go have that conversation and discuss the details of that card, drill it on down to further additional stories, drill it on down to its confirmation criteria. This is the acceptance criteria that comes from the product owner and or other stakeholders that tells the development team exactly what to go build. Again, I'll give you an example. So we have the product backlog. Maybe we're going to take these 6 stories during this backlog refinement meeting. We're going to pull them out one at a time, discuss them in detail. And if it's ambiguous, if there's anything unclear about the story, maybe it says we're going to process the report quickly. Well, what does quickly mean? Or what does process mean? So make sure that everybody understands and has a clear picture of exactly what the requirement is. Refine it into more detail as necessary. This may even include splitting stories. Get all your questions answered so the development community can ask any questions during this meeting to make sure that everybody comes to consensus on exactly what the requirement is. What does it mean? What are we supposed to go build? And we come up with the acceptance criteria. The product owner and the stakeholders now have an agreement with the development team on what has to be true when they deliver the functionality in order for that functionality to be accepted and potentially used. It's basically going to refine and potentially reprioritize. So for example, if we split an epic during this refinement meeting, we may have, some of the stories from that may get sorted into different places in the product backlog of different priorities. Or now that we know about a story, maybe we don't have enough information to say it's ready for the next sprint. We may have to move it down in priority and gather more information before it's ready for the next, to be picked into the next sprint. And then we have the confirmation, as I said. So let's just use the example of, as a customer, I can select the type of gas to be pumped in order to pump the correct type of gas into my vehicle. Simple, right? There's a story. What might be its acceptance criteria? And this drills directly into what are we going to test and what are we going to demonstrate to the customer at the end to prove to them that they should accept this story as being done. So some simple ones: if I select regular gas, it should pump regular gas. If I select super or premium, it should pump those types of gas. But you should also be thinking about negative confirmation as well, or negative testing. What if they select one type of gas and then immediately select another type and go, no, what? I didn't mean regular, I wanted super. What should happen? ... This may be a question. Do you want it to lock in the first type and not let them select a second type? Or do you want them to just keep selecting types and you resolve whichever the last one is they picked is the one you're going to pump? So these confirmations lead to more conversations and so on until you get it, a set of confirmations that everybody agrees to. What if they put two fingers out and push regular and premium at the same time? Do you get a mixture? Do you get an error message? What happens? What if they don't select a type of gas? They just get in their car and drive away. Well, their credit card's hanging out there, right? Does the next person get a pull up? Is there some kind of timeout that needs to happen? How long does that timeout need to be? So these are, by coming up with the confirmations, you're further refining the requirements of exactly what the product needs to do to meet this new user need that's defined in the story. What if they press cancel? What if they press some other key, like they press the enter key or something and get it? Maybe they get an error message. What if somebody hits an emergency all stop while that prompt is up? What are all the things that need to happen in the product? So I talked about also breaking epics and even other stories down into smaller stories. So one of the things you can do, we have this epic here. Let's say it's moved up enough that it might get selected in the next sprint or two. We're going to pull that epic out. We're going to discuss it and break it down into further stories. We're going to then reprioritize and put those stories back into the product backlog in the appropriate order, so that they are, and then we're going to, in the backlog, in this backlog refinement meeting, we will start at the top now that we've split these stories and talk about each story, have the conversation, create the criteria for acceptance. So make sure that they're reprioritized back into the product backlog. So given that step, now we have a product backlog where the top of it, the ones that are likely to get pulled into the next iteration or two, are ready. So let's start our sprint. And the sprint starts with a sprint planning meeting. This is where the product owner, the Scrum Master, and the development team, basically the people on the Scrum team, those three main roles, are going to get together and plan the sprint, the iteration. They're going to start by selecting things off of the product backlog until they've got enough work for that sprint, and then they're going to turn it into what's called a sprint backlog. So let's talk about this for a minute. Basically, again, the sprint starts with this planning meeting, and it's really kind of two meetings in one. The first one is going to select the product backlog. So we're going to identify the sprint goal. What are we trying to accomplish in this particular iteration? And we're going to reprioritize the backlog. Notice we've done this in the refinement meeting. We did it as we added the things. We're doing it one last time because something may have changed since yesterday. So the first thing we're going to do is say, okay, this story, all of a sudden we've discovered is really, really important for some reason. And we're going to shift things around and reprioritize our list. Simple as that. Then once we've done one last prioritization, we're going to answer any remaining questions. Maybe one of the items on the product backlog had an outstanding issue. It wasn't quite ready, but we knew we could get it ready before the planning meeting. So one more time, we go through the same steps that we did with the planning meeting. Are there any outstanding issues? Do we need to have any more conversations around this? Are there any new acceptance criteria that we need to pull for these stories? And then we're going to select an iteration's worth of stories. And actually, these two steps are interchangeable. We're going to take the first story off the highest priority one off the list and do that third bullet there. We're going to talk about it. Is there any remaining questions? Is there any remaining stuff? No, let's pull it over. Then we talk about the next story. And then we talk and pick it and talk about the next story and pick it. Now, if it's not ready, we have to skip it. It will remain on the product backlog and not be pulled over into the iteration because it's just not ready. And then we're going to finally obtain the development community's commitment to the product owner that everything that's been selected into this product backlog can be done during this iteration, that we're not overcommitting ourselves. Because again, this is kind of creating the work breakdown structure for this next iteration at the highest levels. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull one story at a time off the product backlog, talk about it, and say, okay, those are the 3 stories we can do. Now, how do we know this? We know how many people are on the team. We know who's going on vacation this week, who can only work part-time, who can, and we know what our velocity is, how much size can we do or product can we build per 2-week iteration. And we fill up our bucket. And when we're done, we're done. We don't try and put 3 gallons of water in a 2-gallon bucket. We fill it up till it's just enough. At that point, the product backlog moves up, those stories have been removed. And sometime during the next iteration, now we're going to be working from the top of the new backlog, product backlog. Okay. The second half of this meeting then is to translate this into what's called the sprint backlog, the work we're actually doing. And this is where we take those high-level stories and break them down into all the tasks we have to do to implement that story. So, for example, story number 1 here has 3 major tasks associated with it. This might be, I got to code this piece of code, I got to run these test cases, I've got to update the user manual. Some other story may only have a couple. Some other story may have many tasks, just like a normal work breakdown structure. Whatever you got to do, you got to do. And then you're going to estimate the amount of effort or story points. And I'll talk about story points here in just a second. So we've got that product backlog. We've got the selected tasks. The team talks about that story. And the team decides what they have to do, what are all the tasks they have to do to implement that first story. And that becomes a list of tasks. Then they do that for the second story, then they do that for the third story. Then they go through and estimate how many hours of effort or how many story points. And story points is just a relative metric. One story point means that it's going to take some block of time as defined by the team or some block of effort. If it's 5 story points, it's 5 times the amount of work, or it's 5 times bigger than the other thing. It's a relative metric. So some people use a Fibonacci sequence to estimate these. However you want to do it, you're going to go through and estimate. And the last thing you do in this planning meeting is the team self-assigns itself to what it's going to do during the first day of the iteration. So maybe Susie and I take on that task, and Tom and Larry take on that task, and George takes on this one all by himself. We have a 5-member team. And we've picked those things to go work on, and we go work for a day. And that's where we do the iteration. So we've got the sprint backlog coming in, which is the stories we've selected and all the tasks to implement them. We do our first day of work. That's the sprint iteration. And then every day we have a status meeting called the daily scrum, also called the daily stand-up meeting. There's many names for it. And we're going to do that every day of the iteration for however many days we've decided the iteration is. If it's 2 weeks long, we're going to have 10 days of work. We're going to have 10 daily meetings, 1 for each day. And then at the end of that, output is going to be an increment of work that's been done. The iteration itself is called the heart of the sprint because there is where the work is done. That's where everything is being created. Just to give you a peek of how it fits into the process, as we come out of the sprint planning meeting, we're going to work for a day on the tasks that we put into the to-do list for the day. And at the end of that day, we are going to have our daily Scrum meeting. And in this daily Scrum meeting, these are kept short and sweet. They're facilitated by the Scrum Master. 15-minute stand-up meeting. Now, why stand up? Because if you sit down, you get comfortable, you start chitty-chatting, and the meeting takes a lot longer. These daily meetings are kept to 15 minutes. Everybody stands up. Each member goes to the board, or pairs if you paired on something like Cindy and I were working on that one task together, we both walk to the board. But they literally call it walking the board. And what you're doing is you're coming back to this board, your task board, and looking at each of those things. So Cindy and I are going to talk about the 8 tasks there, the one that was 8 story points or 8 hours of effort. And then the next person's going to come up and talk about their task and so on. And we're going to talk about 3 things: what we have accomplished since the last daily Scrum meeting, what we're going to do this coming day, what we're going to do next, and are there any impediments? Is there anything that's in our way of getting our work done? And those last things, again, we're going to talk about them, but we're not going to try and solve the problem here. The Scrum Master will work outside the iteration with the appropriate members of the team, etc. You don't have those big, long discussions, but you're always trying to, remove the impediments. That's done as part of your work. So here we go. We've done a day's worth of work. We're having our very first daily Scrum meeting. Cindy and I get up and say, we worked on this task. Instead of it taking us 8 units, whatever our estimate was, it only took us 6, and we're done with it. And we move it into the done pile. And then Cindy says, okay, I'm going to work on this 3 task, and I say I'm going to go work on this 1 task. So we bring those over from the to-do into the in progress. That's what we're going to do next. Then I don't remember the names, Larry and somebody else, George, whatever. They say, we've spent 9 hours working on this task. We spent 10 hours working on this task. We're not done yet. But based on what we know, we assume there's still 9 units of work left to do. So we're going to continue in this next day of work, continuing to work on that. This one was supposed to take 3. It actually took 3. We are done with it. This one, then whoever was doing that one, Curly, pulls another task over. And Curly says, oh, by the way, while I was working on that 3-day task, I realized we forgot that we have to migrate the database in order to do this story. We have to add a field to the database, so we're going to have to do a migration. We've got another task that we didn't think of. Now notice, we're not adding any new stories. We're not adding any new features. But as we learn, we may have to add new tasks to get those stories done. So we add that new task to the to-do list and we estimate it. And now we're done with our daily Scrum. We move on to the next day of work. We have our second. And at the end of the second one, we've moved more tasks to the done pile. Notice we have pulled that last 8 unit of effort task into our in progress pile. And now we can start pulling stuff from story 2. Remember, these are in priority order. So we don't start story 2 until at least everything in the higher priority story 1, is at least in progress. We have to have all of story 2 stuff at least in progress before we start pulling tasks from story 3. That way, if something is left undone, it's the lowest priority story. And if it's left undone at the end of the sprint, it will be moved back onto the product backlog ready for the next sprint. So by the end of all these daily meetings, everything should be done. And we know how we estimated it. We know how much we actually spent on things. For example, if you look at story 2, we had one task that we estimated as 21 units, and it actually took us 37. Why? So we're going to be looking at things like that in our retrospective meeting. But we've moved everything over. We've got that increment of functionality done. If for some reason, like I said, the last story still has tasks in the in progress, we move that story back onto the product backlog. Now, the work that was done is still done, and hopefully we can take advantage of that. But by the time we get back to that story, if higher priority things have come in, something may have changed. So the work may or may not have been useful to us. This is why we don't want to overestimate. The expectation is you get done with everything every time, and you keep adjusting until you get good at getting everything done. Remember, we've made a commitment to the product owner that we're going to do all these things, and we do everything we can to meet that commitment. And one of the ways we do that is what are called burn up or burn down charts. I'm showing you a burn up here. You start at 0 and say we have 0 tasks completed. Let's say we had 100, what is it, about 108 units of work to do. And every time we move something to the done pile, we give ourselves a new point. So at every daily meeting during the 10-day iteration, because again, 2 weeks, right? Would be 10 working days. We're going to add a new point to this graph and track it against that straight line of going from having nothing done to having everything done. Helps us keep in sync. Now, while this iteration is happening, folks, if there's any new stories, any new epics, it does not interrupt the work of the team. The work of the team is going to work on that product, the selected product backlog stories only. Anything new goes into the product backlog, and it gets goes through the backlog refinement meeting, so it's ready for the next iteration, but we don't interrupt the work of this iteration. So if we have a new story coming in, it's put in priority order. If we have a new epic coming in, it's going to be put in priority order. We'll go to the backlog refinement meetings and start breaking these down. That way, the Scrum team can stay focused on its current goals. They're not getting interrupted. They're not getting jerked around. They're not trying to multitask. They can get done what they promised to get done. And almost anything should be able to wait for a couple of weeks. Nothing is so high priority, or rarely is anything so high priority that it can't wait for the end of a duration. So during the sprint, you're refining things. You may add additional tasks. You may ask more questions. You may find out that you need to do additional things, but you're always going to focus just on the stories that you selected. However, if something is so important that you can get the product owner to agree, then you stop the sprint, right dead in its tracks. You moved all the stories back onto the product backlog. Of course, this new thing will now be at the very highest priority, or otherwise you wouldn't have stopped the sprint, right? And you just start with a new sprint planning meeting and start over. By the time those stories that you put back on the product backlog are have filtered up to the top, hopefully the work you've done on them is still valuable to you. It may be, it may not be. Usually it is. But again, all change happens on that product backlog. If you have to put something new into the sprint, you don't. You just stop the sprint, you move everything back and start over with a new product, with a new sprint planning meeting. So this should happen like really infrequently, folks. You are impacting your productivity. You are impacting the delivery of the product. If this is happening all the time, then you're in trouble. You're just not estimating things right, or you have not done a good job of building a good backlog. Almost everything should be able to wait for the duration of the iteration. This is why one of the principles that we talked about earlier says, we're going to do everything in short iterations, a month or less, with a preference towards the shorter. In fact, the extreme programmers, which is one of the other frameworks of Agile, says that an iteration should never last more than a week. You come in Monday morning, have your planning meeting, you deliver the increment of functionality on Friday afternoon, and everybody goes home and has a good, restful weekend. So out of this iteration is going to come some kind of increment of product functionality or service functionality. It may not be complete, it may not be anything that's actually deliverable, but something's been done. Features, functions, stories have been added to the work product. And you have what's called the sprint review meeting. This is where the product owner and any other stakeholders that want to can come back in and look at the product. This is where the team literally demonstrates every acceptance criteria for every story that they did during the sprint. And the product owner agrees to them. Any other stakeholders can have input about what they like, what they don't like. If there was any incomplete stories that came out of the iteration, they go back onto the product backlog. If there's any issues from this meeting, now that I see it, I love it, but I also want this and this. Or now that I see it, that's not what I meant at all. Let's change the acceptance criteria for this story and put it back on the product backlog. So any issues, any story, the sprint is over, folks. If you find any defects, you put them back. Again, you create a story. This stakeholder needs this defect corrected in order to, and you have that review meeting where you go over the acceptance criteria. At that point, traditional Scrum says, should you deliver the functionality? Is there enough done now, iteration after iteration after iteration, that you have that minimal viable product? If so, deliver it. If not, either way, you're going to go on. But we're going to deliver that functionality, and that's the traditional, that's the make the decision every sprint. There's also other methods that are being used. However, this is, remember, a framework, and you get to adopt and adapt it to whatever works for you and your organization. So one way of doing it is every time a major feature package is completed, then you make the decision. Other people literally will go on a cycle of every, if you look at, for example, the SAFe, they'll do 6 iterations and then deliver, and 6 more iterations and then deliver. So they're releasing every 6 iterations, whatever's appropriate to you and your team. The last thing you do is what we used to call a project retrospective, a project lessons learned, a project postmortem. Folks, I never liked that because I didn't kill my project, hopefully. They call it a sprint retrospective. The extreme programmers call it a reflection. Whatever you call it, you sit down for some period of time and talk about what went well that we need to repeat, what went badly that we need to stop doing, how can we improve things? And as quality professionals, I love this built-in lessons learned continuous improvement cycle. If there are any improvements, if it's just, we can start doing this instead of that, but it's not going to take any time of the team, you just start doing this instead of that. But if it is an item that's going to take team time to implement, for example, you need to go write a new process, or you need to go have some training, whatever it is, it goes back on the backlog as a new story. Now you're literally saying, as a member of the Scrum development team, I need the following training in order to be able to do blah, 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 blah. or as a member of the sprint development team, we need to upgrade to the new version of the operating system XYZ in order to do blah, blah, blah. And it just becomes a story. If it's going to take time, it gets prioritized with all the other stories. Maybe it can wait a while. Maybe it's an emergency that needs to be done right now. So it goes to the top of the priority list, feeding into the next planning meeting. And last but not, so this reflection, I already said this, I got ahead of myself. What went well? What can we improve? Prioritize those improvement actions. If they take team time, add them to the product backlog. What do we need to start doing? What do we need to stop doing? What do we need to continue doing? And last but not least, we stop and say, at this point, the product owner makes a decision. Given what we've finished to date, however many sprints we've done, is there anything left on that product backlog worthy of spending money and time on? If the answer is no, the project's over. There may still be things on the product backlog, but they're not important enough to spend time and money on. An example here, I was talking to one lady who they were building information systems for doctors' offices. And they had come up with like 17 different ways of searching for patients. And each one of those became a story. So there were 17 different stories about searching for patients on the product backlog. The ones that rose to top priority were searching by name and birth date. And they got done in a very early iteration. And the other ones just kept falling farther and farther and farther down on the product backlog in priority. And at the end, the product owner decided the other 15 things, they were never going to sort that way. That name and birth date were the only ones they ever sorted on. And there was no need to do any of the others. Now, if we'd have done traditional software development, those other 15 sort methods would have been built into the product. But we didn't need them. They were never going to use them. That's a whole lot of expense that didn't have to happen. And oh, by the way, opportunity to have one of them be wrong and have a defect in it. Now, one last slide I wanted to show you here, folks, real quick, is Scrum teams are typically 7 people plus or minus 2 is an ideal Scrum team size for the development team, plus and then add on top of that the Scrum Master and the product owner. But what happens if you have a project that needs 30 people or 50 people? Because it's just a large project. And this is where we start scaling Scrum. A lot of people refer to scrums of scrums. The official one that comes out of the Scrum Alliance is the Nexus. There's also multiple other methodologies for scaling Scrum. But now basically what you do is everybody's working off a single massive product backlog that is being prioritized. But now in sprint planning, the first thing you do is have all of those people get together, maybe all 50 of them. And they look through that product backlog and assign stories to each of the Scrum teams. You now have multiple Scrum teams each. And now what they say is no more than 20 people, but typically, like I said, 7 plus or minus 2. So each story that's selected goes on to the sprint backlog, but each team has its own backlog as well that they're working from. And then each team goes and works. Each team has a daily meeting, and then a representative from each team goes and has a coordination meeting each day as well. So everybody will hold their daily meeting for their team, and then another daily meeting where all the teams come together. Now, they also have what they call a Nexus integration team, which are a set of subject matter experts that cross teams and help them. For example, you probably need a single architect that's helping all the teams coordinate the interfaces between their parts of the software, et cetera. Out of that's going to become increment of functionality, but now each team contributes to that increment of functionality. And you demonstrate all of that. Each team gets up and demonstrates their part to the product owner and other stakeholders. You may or may not deliver that functionality. Now you have what's called, you still have your retrospective. And there's actually 3 meetings here. The whole team of 50 people get together and talk about it. Then each team breaks up and has their own retrospective. And then they come together one last time and summarize everything the teams found, because one team may find something that benefits other teams. And we iterate again until we're done. Here's the references that I pulled stuff out of, just FYI for additional information. I never talk about myself very much. And by the way, I've updated my slide to 45 years instead of more than 40. It's now 45 as of this year. So I updated the slide. I didn't do that before I sent it to Bob. But here's a little bit about myself. He's already read it. Well, we're going into the question and answer period here. So get your questions ready. One last thing I wanted to mention. I have started a year ago now, the Software Excellence Academy, where I'm putting all my online training, etc. But one of the things that comes out of that is free webinars every Wednesday. We pick a topic each month. The March topic is software verification. The 3 webinars that are left are the fundamentals of software testing, a deep dive into boundary testing, how not to be a tester of software. And in April, and this is why I wanted to do this, we're going to be talking, I talked about Scrum here. We're going to be talking about some of the other Agile methodologies. We'll have 4 of them. Haven't got my topics together yet, but either myself or other experts present. And if you're interested at all, these are all free. You can sign up. You just have to give me your name and email. And oh, by the way, I also have usually a month or 2's worth of previous webinar recordings out there that you can listen to. If you have any questions after the fact, if we don't get to all the questions today, you can shoot me an email. It's usually the easiest way of getting a hold of me. And my website is westfallteam.mykajabi.com. And that's where the Software Engineering Institute is. So with that, Bob, or anybody else really, but I'm going to turn it back over to you, Bob, for question and answer and close out.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Linda, for an excellent presentation on Scrum, the basic mechanics and how it works. I think you did an outstanding job covering all the little but important details of how a Scrum works and what are all the different steps. Does anybody out in the audience have any questions? You can unmute yourself if you'd like. If you don't want to ask your question in front of a large group, there was a suggestion made from the last meeting, Linda, that after I complete my final wrap up, rather than just end the meeting right away, I could say, okay, the meeting's over, people can leave. If there are a few people who do want to ask a question, but they don't want to ask in the large audience, would you be available for a couple minutes just to see if anyone is hanging around?
Absolutely, I can hang around. Or like I said, they can contact me anytime in the future by just shooting an email. Okay, great. So we'll give it a try. So certainly if anybody has a question and you don't feel embarrassed to ask a question in the large group, believe me, I believe there's quite a few of us who this whole idea of Agile and Scrums is relatively new, having not worked in the software industry. But I do appreciate your time, Linda. I have a better understanding myself of how I can see how this would fit into, say, Agile manufacturing, which I read here more and more about. So I do see someone has raised your hand. Let's see. Vic, you got a question?
Yes, hi, Linda. First of all, thank you. Thanks a lot. This is Vic. I'm also the program chair of the section, and I've had the pleasure of attending your presentations at ASQ conferences or trainings and so on and so forth. So that's how I came to know. And I also recall you're a master a pyrotechnic something. You can say that better than me, but and
yeah,
I know that's
in
why
fact, this photo here is some of my comments.
Yep. Wow.
I am a grandmaster of the PGI, the Pyrotechnic Guild International Conference. They have had 50 conferences once a year, so they've been going for 50 years. I'm still the only female in the 50-year history to have won Grandmaster. It's not normally a female activity, but my husband and I have really gotten into it.
That's wonderful. That's incredible. So yeah, I could ask some questions on that, but I don't want to derail this Q&A session. So one question is, in terms of comparing and contrasting Scrum, Agile, Extreme Programming, Safe, is there something on your website that compares and contrasts where one can quickly see how these are similar or different and applicability, which one is more suitable when?
Well, actually, that was one of the things that I was thinking about for webinars for April of this year. Right now, nothing, but many of them focus on different things and they're very compatible. For example, Scrum focuses on how you're going to manage the project and how you're going to notice, and then you do the work is that little iteration, that little heart of, and there's no real detail because it says, let the team decide. Where Extreme Programming focuses much more on the engineering techniques, like pair programming, like, stories and how to do your software development activities. So I see a lot of software teams literally using Scrum to run things and XP for the details inside the iteration. And then they use Lean for their process improvement side of the house. So I literally have customers that are using all three. And in fact, if you look at SAFE that I mentioned briefly, which is the scaled Agile framework for enterprises, that's where the SAFE comes from, they actually have combined Lean and Scrum and XP and DevOps and took things from all of those to create their framework. They are, again, one of the scaled Agile mechanisms where you have teams and teams of teams, and it goes all the way to the enterprise level of how you would plan your portfolio of projects. So they fit together.
Understood. Yeah. Well, thanks. That's a good summary.
Scrum Bond, I mentioned Scrum Bond takes Scrum, but instead of having a task board like I showed you, where it's just ready, in progress, and done, they actually use a Kanban board where it walks through. So they replace the task board with the Kanban board and they call it Scrum Bond.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Linda. That's a good summary. And I'll see if I can join your April webinar.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about some of those in April and how they compare and contrast.
Great.
Anything else?
Thank you again, Linda.
Thank you.
So without, I guess, any additional questions.
Yeah, Bob, I have a question.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Jim.
So let's say there's quality management system software out there, and one of the things that have frustrated the medical device companies is we have some different twists associated with it. You talk about bringing money in. How do you know when to say it's now mature enough for us to sell it on the outside?
Well, that's the concept of a minimum viable product.
Okay.
And that is the purview of the product owner. What has to be built into the product to make it that minimal viable product that's marketable? And notice it's an ongoing decision because you have the first minimal viable product.
Yep.
And then the next release adds features to it and makes it a second level minimal viable product, but it's always got to be something that works. It's got to be viable in the field. For example, you can't do a telecom system that can make calls but not receive them, or an inventory control system that lets you check things into inventory, but you can't check things back out of inventory.
Sure.
It's got to be a minimum viable product. But to use the telecom example, all I need to do is for a minimum viable product is to be able to make a phone call and receive a phone call. The next minimum viable product might have voicemail added, but it has everything you need to be able to make a phone call and do voicemail. And the next one may have call forwarding, and the next one may have, but it's always a viable, complete product that is usable in the field.
Okay, excellent.
Does that make sense?
It definitely does. Thank you.
Okay, good. Any other questions? Okay. Well, as before we close for this evening meeting, just a few last wrap-up comments. Hopefully you've seen this either in the sundial or on my ASQ, but if you would like to participate in a community service type project, the Pikes Peak section, which is located in Colorado Springs, is working with the talent organization to do a virtual blood drive. So if you'd like to participate, there's some helpful instructions here of how to schedule now. And I know there are a couple of different the talent locations here in the state of Arizona. So if you like to contribute blood and you have the time and you would like to participate, you can do that through the Pikes Peak section. Remember, we are out on social media, so you can stay connected with the Phoenix section on a wide variety of platforms. You can feel free to contribute your own thoughts, be part of the network by joining in on discussions or creating your own. And then finally, don't forget to please complete the evaluation survey, which will be emailed out to you shortly. And also part of that email from John Linland will be your RU certification. And next month, April 8th, is the second Thursday of the month. And our speaker will be Govind Ramu from Google. And that individual will be presenting information on the new draft standard of ISO 10014, which is a guidance standard, not a requirements, but a guidance standard for realizing financial and economic benefits. So as we talk about cost of quality, here's a standard that could help you to standardize your approach to measuring the cost of quality and economic benefits to your organization. So it should be an interesting discussion and a little bit different from a hard technical tool to more of a overall quality management system. So do look forward to hearing from Govind. And oh, by the way, if you missed our presentation in January, which was by Mukesh Agrawal of Wiley, he gave a presentation on innovation using design thinking concept. So tonight we had a presentation on more or less on Agile, but more specifically on Scrum. In January, Mukesh gave a presentation on design thinking and innovation. And that's one of those meetings where I forgot to hit the record button. So, but fortunately, the Pikes Peak section again has coordinated with Mukesh. And if you have time available, if you either missed our presentation or you'd like to hear it again, you can join the Pikes Peak program meeting, which will be virtual via WebEx on April 14th. So their meeting is coming up in April as well. And I'll have information out there for you on our My ASQ page. But so just a heads up, if you're interested in design thinking, there's a repeat performance coming up in April. And then our talk will be on on the new ISO standard. So with that, I am concluding the meeting. Thank you again for all of your attendance. If you wish to hang around, I will keep it open for a couple minutes if you do have a question for Linda. Otherwise, we'll consider this meeting over and hope you have a great month. Thank you, everybody.